This is lesson 6.5, rhombi and squares. Your objectives are to recognize and apply properties of rhombi and squares, and to determine whether quadrilaterals are rectangles, rhombi, or squares. A rhombus is a quadrilateral with 4 congruent sides. Since opposite sides are congruent, it's a parallelogram, so you have all the properties of a parallelogram. Rhombi, which is the plural of rhombus, rhombi also have perpendicular diagonals, and each diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles. A square has 4 congruent sides and 4 congruent angles. A square is both a rectangle and a rhombus because of that. So for squares, they also have all properties of parallelograms, rectangles, and rhombi. Remember all of the properties and look at each situation and use the rule that applies. Quadrilateral ABCD is a rhombus. Find each value or measure. If the measure of angle ABD is 60, find the measure of angle BDC. Well, in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect opposite angles. So if the measure of angle ABD is 60 degrees, then the measure of angle DBC is also 60 degrees. And that symmetry applies to the other end of the rhombus as well. Those two angles are also 60 degrees. Therefore, the measure of angle BDC is 60. In a rhombus, the diagonals bisect opposite angles. And for each pair of opposite angles, those 4 halves are always congruent in a rhombus. Number 2, if the measure of segment AE is 8, find the measure of segment AC. Well, in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect each other. We're dealing with a half of a diagonal here, which means the other half is also 8. Put those two together and you get the length of segment AC, which is 16. In a rhombus, the diagonals bisect each other. Number 3, if the measure of segment AB is 26 and the measure of segment BD is 20, find the measure of segment AE. Well, the diagonal BD is 20 and it's cut in half, so I can put the 2 halves of 10 right there. Segment AE is part of the other diagonal, and if you remember that the diagonals are perpendicular, we have a right angle right there. Focus on those side lengths. That's a right triangle. And when you know 2 sides of a right triangle, the Pythagorean theorem will get you the 3rd side, and that'll get us the length of segment AE. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Remember that A and B are the legs, so that'll be X and 10, and C is the hypotenuse, which is 26. Solve for X. 10 squared is 100, and 26 squared is 676. Subtract 100, and then take the square root of each side. X is 24. So the measure of segment AE is 24. In this question, we were dealing with diagonal lengths and one of the side lengths, and we were able to narrow it down to the lengths of the sides of one triangle. Since the diagonals are perpendicular, that gave us a right angle, which made a right triangle, and you can use the Pythagorean theorem to find the 3rd side of a right triangle. Number 6, if the measure of segment AE is 3x minus 1, and the measure of segment AE is 16, find x. Well, segment AC is a diagonal, and in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect each other. So that means that each half of that diagonal is 8 units long. And I can see that the measure of segment AE is 3x minus 1, and it's 8, which means that 3x minus 1 has to equal 8. Add 1 to each side. Divide both sides by 3, and x equals 3. Remember that in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect each other, so those halves are congruent. Number 8, if the measure of segment AD is 2x plus 4, and the measure of segment CD is 4x minus 4, find x. Well, in a rhombus, sides are congruent, and we have 2 side lengths there. Those sides are congruent and their measures are equal. Solve for x. Get the x's together and subtract 2x from each side. Add 4 to each side. And divide both sides by 2. X is 4. So remember, in a rhombus, all the sides are congruent, so their measures are equal. To prove that a parallelogram is a rectangle, rhombus, or square, you can use these theorems. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then it's a rhombus. If one diagonal of a parallelogram bisects a pair of opposite angles, then it's a rhombus. If one pair of consecutive sides of a parallelogram are congruent, then it's a rhombus. And if a quadrilateral is a rectangle and a rhombus, then it's a square. Remember these theorems whenever you're trying to prove that something is a rhombus or a square. Given each set of vertices, determine whether quadrilateral ABCD is a rhombus, rectangle, or square. List all that apply and explain. For number 1, you have points A, B, C, and D. Let's determine what type of shape it is. Start by testing to see if it's a rhombus. Find the length of each side using the distance formula. When you do the distance formula for each side is the square root of 8 units long. Since all sides are congruent, it's a rhombus. Next, let's test and see if it's a rectangle. To be a rectangle, it needs 4 right angles. So let's find the slope of each side, and if consecutive sides have slopes that are negative reciprocals, then that means we have right angles and it would be a rectangle. When you find the slope of each side, consecutive sides have slopes that are negative reciprocals, which means that we have 4 right angles. And if we have 4 right angles, then the shape is a rectangle. And since it's a rhombus and a rectangle, then this shape is also a square. So use the distance formula to find the side lengths to see if they're all the same, which would make it a rhombus. Find the slope of each side to see if consecutive sides are perpendicular, which would make it a rectangle. And if it's a rhombus and a rectangle, then it's also a square. For number 3, we'll plot these points, and first we'll test to see if it's a rhombus. A rhombus has 4 congruent sides, so let's do the distance formula for each of the sides to see how long they are. When you do the distance formula for each side is the square root of 13 units long. Since they're all the same, this is a rhombus. Next, we'll check to see if it's a rectangle. To be a rectangle, the four angles have to be right angles, so consecutive sides need to be perpendicular. Let's use the slope formula. I can see after testing the first two sides that these sides are not perpendicular. 3/2 and -3/2 are not negative reciprocals. So those are not right angles. This is not a rectangle because the sides are not perpendicular. And since it's not a rectangle, it's also not a square. So this shape is only a rhombus because the four sides are congruent.